Margaret sat by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Outside, the early Oregon morning looked calm, dew on the grass, sunlight slipping through the trees, and the soft sound of birds waking up. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. But inside her heart, nothing was calm. Today was the day she had feared for 22 years. The day her son would finally learn the truth she had hidden from him all his life. Ethan. Her son had come home from college just a few days earlier. He was 22 now, taller than her, confident, yet still with that familiar gentleness that had always made her proud. He had grown into a fine young man, kind-hearted and curious, with the same blue eyes that used to follow her everywhere as a boy. But something had changed since yesterday. He wasn't smiling like before. He wasn't laughing at her little jokes. He looked distant. The reason was sitting on the table between them, a small, worn-out envelope that Ethan had found in the attic. Inside it were a few old hospital papers and a faded photograph of a baby wrapped in a white blanket. The name written on the birth certificate wasn't hers. It wasn't even close. Ethan had confronted her last night, holding the envelope in his hand, his voice trembling. "Mom," he had said quietly, "what is this? Why does this say adoption?" Margaret had frozen. She had imagined this moment so many times, how she would tell him, what words she would use, how she would hold his hand and explain everything. But when it finally came, she couldn't say a word. All she had managed to whisper was, "We'll talk tomorrow." Now, tomorrow had come. Ethan sat across from her at the breakfast table, his expression calm but heavy, his eyes searching hers for answers. He looked older today, like the truth he didn't yet know had. It's already changed something inside him. Margaret took a deep breath and placed her cup down. "Ethan," she began softly, "you deserve to know everything." Her voice shook slightly, but she forced herself to keep going. "You were adopted when you were just a few weeks old. Your biological mother was very young. She couldn't take care of you. She wanted you to have a better life. So she gave you to me." The words came slowly, each one heavier than the last. Margaret had kept this truth locked inside for more than 2 decades. But saying it out loud felt like opening a wound that had never healed. Ethan blinked, his brow furrowing. He leaned back slightly, trying to process what he had just heard. "So, you're not my real mother?" he asked finally, his voice low, uncertain. Margaret's heart broke at that question. "I may not have given birth to you," she said, tears forming in her eyes, "but I am your mother in every way that matters. I've loved you from the moment I first held you in my arms, Ethan. You are my son, always have been, always will be." But Ethan didn't say anything. He just stared at the papers on the table, the truth settling deep into his mind. For a few seconds, the room was completely silent except for the faint ticking of the wall clock. Margaret wanted to reach out to him to hold his hand, but something stopped her fear. Fear that he wouldn't want her touch anymore. Finally, Ethan stood up. He ran a hand through his hair and said quietly, "I just need some air." Then he walked out the door. Margaret didn't try to stop him. She knew he needed time. As she watched him walk down the path toward the street, she felt her heart ache in a way she hadn't felt in years. It was the same kind of ache she had felt the day she brought him home from the hospital, scared, uncertain, and full of love she didn't know how to express. She sat alone at the kitchen table, her hands trembling. Around her, everything looked the same, the neatly arranged dishes, the sound of the clock, the smell of coffee. But her world had shifted. For 22 years, she had lived with a secret, telling herself she would reveal it when the time was right. But the truth was, she had never believed there would be a right time. There was only ever fear. Fear that he would see her differently. Fear that he would stop calling her mom. As the day stretched on, Margaret found herself lost in memories. She remembered the first time she saw Ethan, a tiny baby wrapped in a blue blanket, sleeping peacefully. The nurse had placed him in her arms, and at that moment she had known her life would never be the same. She remembered his first steps, his first words, his laughter echoing through the house. Every birthday, every school recital, every scraped knee, she had been there for all of it. And now all of that felt fragile, like a picture about to fall off the wall. Evening came, but Ethan didn't return home. Margaret sat by the window, the lights of passing cars flickering across her face. Her heart was heavy, but she didn't cry. She had already cried too many tears over this secret in the past. Instead, she sat quietly, waiting just as she had waited for him to take his first steps. To come home from his first day of school, to call her after his first heartbreak. Waiting was something mothers did best. When the clock struck midnight, she finally heard the sound of footsteps outside. Ethan opened the door slowly and stepped inside. His face was tired, his eyes red, but he wasn't angry. He just looked lost. "I drove around for hours," he said, his voice rough. "I didn't know where to go." Margaret nodded. "That's okay," she said softly. "You don't have to say anything right now." Ethan sat down across from her. He stared at her for a long time before finally speaking. "All my life, I thought I knew who I was. I thought I knew where I came from. Now it feels like everything's changed." Margaret's eyes filled again. "I know," she said, "and I'm so sorry. I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid. I didn't want to lose you." "You didn't lose me," Ethan said quietly, though his tone was unsure. "I just need to understand." Margaret nodded again. "You will," she promised. "I'll tell you everything I know about your birth mother, about how you came to me. But before that, I just need you to know one thing, Ethan." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You are my son. Nothing changes that." Ethan didn't pull away. He didn't speak either. He just looked at her, really looked as if seeing her not as the woman who had lied, but as the woman who had raised him, who had been there for every moment that mattered. After a long silence, he whispered, "I need time, Mom." Margaret smiled faintly through her tears. "Take all the time you need. I'll be right here." Later that night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Margaret thought about the years ahead. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Ethan would have questions, doubts, maybe even anger. But she also knew that love, real love, was stronger than blood. It was built through years of care, sacrifice, and moments that no truth could erase. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "He'll come back. He has to." Down the hall, Ethan sat in his room, the envelope still in his hands. He looked at the papers, then at a framed photo of him and Margaret from his high school graduation. She was smiling, proud, her arm around him. In that moment, he realized something. No document, no revelation, could change the fact that she had been the one who raised him. He wiped his eyes, placed the photo on his nightstand, and whispered softly into the quiet room, "She'll always be my mom." But deep inside, he also felt something else, a growing curiosity about where he really came from, about the woman who had given him life but not raised him. That curiosity would soon lead him and Margaret into a journey neither of them expected. The next morning, Margaret awoke to the sound of sunlight streaming through the curtains and birds chirping outside the window. The kitchen smelled faintly of yesterday's coffee, and the house was quiet, except for the occasional hum of a passing car. She had expected Ethan to be up early, eager to ask questions, or maybe still retreating into himself. Instead, he was nowhere to be seen. Margaret poured herself a fresh cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the small stack of papers that had changed everything. Adoption records, hospital files, and the old photograph of a baby. She picked up the envelope and traced her finger along the creased edges. It was time to help Ethan understand the truth and, more importantly, to guide him through the next steps of discovering his real mother. Ethan finally appeared around noon, carrying a backpack and looking both nervous and determined. His hair was a mess from sleeping in, and his eyes still held the uncertainty of someone grappling with a revelation that could shift their entire sense of identity. Margaret smiled faintly, offering him the coffee she had just poured. "You need energy," she said. Ethan accepted the cup without speaking, sitting across from her at the table. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, words failing. Margaret finally broke the silence. "I've contacted a private agency that helps with reunion searches," she said carefully. They can help us locate your birth mother if that's something you want to do. Ethan hesitated, swirling his coffee absent-mindedly. I I don't know, he admitted. Part of me wants to know her, but part of me is scared. What if I don't like her? What if she doesn't want me? Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. Then we'll deal with it together. No matter what, you're not alone in this. After a long pause, Ethan finally nodded. Okay, he said, determination creeping into his voice. Let's do it. Let's find out. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Margaret and Ethan gathered all the documents, made phone calls, and filled out forms for the agency. They shared meals in silence, occasionally exchanging a few words about school, friends, or the mundane details of everyday life. But beneath it all was a tension, the excitement of discovery mixed with the fear of what they might find. One evening, as they sat on the couch with papers scattered around them, Ethan looked up at Margaret. "Mom," he said, voice quieter than usual, "thank you. I know this is hard for you too." Margaret smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It's hard because I love you, but I also want you to know where you came from. That's important." A week later, the agency finally responded. They had located a woman in Seattle who matched the description on the birth records. She had remarried and had another child, and according to the agency, she had been open to contact under the right circumstances. Ethan's heart raced as he read the email. Margaret could see the mix of emotions, anticipation, fear, curiosity, and a lingering hesitation. "We should wait a few days," Margaret suggested. "This is sudden, and we need to prepare ourselves emotionally." Ethan nodded, though he couldn't hide the eagerness in his eyes. The rest of the week passed slowly. Every phone call, every sound at the door made Ethan's pulse quicken. Margaret tried to keep him grounded, reminding him to breathe, to take one step at a time. But deep down, she understood the real journey was about to begin. Finally, the day arrived. Margaret and Ethan drove to Seattle together, the city skyline slowly appearing as they approached. Ethan stared out the window, trying to picture the woman who had given him life but had not raised him. He wondered about her smile, her voice, the way she might look at him. Margaret noticed his tension and reached over, squeezing his hand gently. When they arrived at the agency office, a receptionist guided them to a small, quiet waiting room. Minutes felt like hours as Ethan sat in silence, staring at the floor. Margaret sat beside him, her own nerves tingling. The door opened, and a woman in her 40s stepped in. She had dark hair pulled back into a neat bun and kind eyes that held a mix of warmth and apprehension. Ethan's breath caught. This was her, the woman who had given him life. Margaret whispered softly, "It's okay. Take your time." Ethan stood slowly, his legs trembling slightly. The woman smiled nervously and extended her hand. "Ethan?" she asked. Her voice was soft, tentative. Ethan hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Yes," he said. I think I'm ready." What followed was a gentle, cautious conversation. They exchanged basic facts, first names, dates, places, as though testing the waters of a relationship that had been separated by decades. Ethan's heart raced as he listened to her stories about the day he was born, the difficult choices she had faced, and the love she had felt for him even when she couldn't raise him. Margaret watched from a nearby chair, her eyes misty. She knew this meeting was about Ethan, not her, but she couldn't help feeling the weight of the moment. She had loved him as her own since the first day she held him, but now she was witnessing him discovering a part of himself she had never known. Hours passed, filled with tentative laughter, quiet questions, and careful explanations. Ethan asked about his birth mother's life, her family, and the reasons behind her decision. Each answer helped him piece together a fuller picture of who he was. He felt a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a profound sense of connection. At one point, the woman whose name was Claire pulled out an old photo album. She opened it to a page showing a baby wrapped in a blue blanket, tiny and sleeping peacefully. "That's you," she said softly. Ethan leaned closer, his fingers tracing the image. He looked up at Margaret, who nodded encouragingly. "I never stopped thinking about you," Claire continued. Every year, I hoped you were happy, that someone loved you as much as I wanted to. Seeing you now, it's more than I ever imagined." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. He had spent his whole life imagining what it might be like to meet her, to understand where he came from. Now that moment was here, and it was overwhelming. I'm glad to meet you," he said quietly. The conversation turned to shared memories, however few there were, and to questions about the future. Claire wanted to be part of Ethan's life, but she understood boundaries and the delicate balance he needed. Margaret stayed close, offering comfort and guidance, helping him navigate the flood of emotions. As the day ended, Ethan felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. Meeting Claire had answered many questions, but it had also opened the door to more. He realized that identity was not just about where you came from, but also about the people who raised you, loved you, and shaped who you were. On the drive home, Ethan was quieter than usual. Margaret glanced at him, sensing the whirlwind of thoughts in his mind. "How do you feel?" she asked gently. Ethan stared out the window, the city lights reflecting in his eyes. "I feel everything," he said finally. "Happy, confused, grateful. Scared? I didn't know I could feel so many things at once." Margaret nodded. "That's okay," she said. "Life is complicated, but so are we. And it's okay to feel everything, to be honest with yourself and with the people who love you." Back at home, Ethan went straight to his room, closing the door behind him. Margaret sat in the living room, sipping her tea, thinking about the day's events. She knew the journey wasn't over. It would take time for Ethan to fully understand, to process, and to integrate this new part of his identity. But she also knew that he was stronger than she had ever imagined. He had faced the truth with courage and had begun to build a bridge to the mother he had never known. Later that night, Ethan came out of his room, looking tired but calm. "Mom," he said softly, "thank you for being here, for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you today." Margaret smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "You never have to find out," she said gently. "I'm your mother, Ethan. That's not going to change. And I'll be with you through every step of this journey." Ethan hugged her, holding on tightly. In that embrace, both of them found a sense of peace, a reassurance that no matter what the future held, the bond they shared was unbreakable. As Margaret watched him go back to his room, she thought about the lessons of the day. That truth, no matter how difficult, could bring clarity. That courage could open doors to understanding. And that love, above all, was what made life meaningful and deep inside. She knew that the most challenging part of their journey was yet to come. The part where Ethan would meet not just his birth mother, but also the fuller reality of himself. She didn't know how he would respond or what emotions would surface. But she also knew one thing for certain. They would face it together as mother and son. The days after the initial meeting with Claire were a mixture of excitement and reflection for Ethan. He woke each morning with a curiosity about the woman who had given him life and a nervous anticipation about what their next contact might reveal. The first meeting had been gentle, cautious, and filled with polite boundaries. But now the questions began to stir in Ethan's mind relentlessly. He wanted to know more about her childhood, her family, her hopes and regrets. Margaret observed him quietly, offering support without pushing. She understood that this part of the journey was Ethan's to navigate. While her heart sometimes felt a pang of uncertainty, fearing that her role in Ethan's life might feel overshadowed by the new relationship, she reminded herself that love was not a competition. It was abundant, capable of stretching to accommodate both the mother who raised him and the mother he had never known. The next week, Claire suggested a small lunch at a quiet cafe near her home. Ethan and Margaret drove to the location, their conversation mostly muted, both lost in thought. Ethan's mind raced with scenarios. Would Claire share stories about his infancy? Would she express regret or guilt for giving him up? Could he feel a connection that would fill the empty spaces in his heart without displacing the love he already felt for Margaret? When they arrived, Claire was waiting outside, smiling softly, her demeanor warm but slightly apprehensive. She greeted Ethan with a hug, careful not to overwhelm him, and then turned to Margaret. "Thank you for coming with him," she said sincerely. "I know this is a lot for both of you." Margaret nodded. "It's important that he has both perspectives," she said. "We want this to be comfortable for him." Ethan followed her inside, and they found a quiet corner table. The cafe hummed with the soft clatter of dishes and distant chatter. As they ordered, Claire began sharing small stories from the time she had learned she was pregnant. She spoke with tenderness, describing the dreams she had, the challenges she faced, and the hope she had for her child's future. Ethan listened intently, the images forming in his mind like a new dimension of his own history. "I always wondered if you were happy," Claire admitted, her voice catching slightly. "I never wanted you to feel abandoned. I hoped that the people who raised you loved you enough to make up for what I couldn't." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. I'm happy," he said slowly. "I mean, I've had Margaret, and she's amazing, but it's strange to think that you're part of this story too." Claire smiled gently. "You can have both," she said. "Life doesn't have to be one or the other. There's room for all of us who care about you." The conversation continued, moving from the past into the present and cautiously toward the future. They discussed Claire's life now, her career, her husband, and her younger child. And Ethan shared his experiences growing up with Margaret. He described school, friends, hobbies, and his own hopes for the future. Each exchange revealed how different yet intertwined their lives had been. And each word helped Ethan understand that family could extend beyond traditional boundaries without diminishing the love he already knew. Margaret listened quietly, occasionally chiming in to clarify facts or provide context. She could see Ethan processing everything, his eyes bright with curiosity and wonder. He asked questions she couldn't answer, about feelings he hadn't felt before and memories he had never made. And Claire responded with honesty and care. By the end of the lunch, Ethan felt a surprising sense of calm. The anxiety and uncertainty that had accompanied the initial meeting had given way to a cautious optimism. He realized that meeting Claire didn't replace the life he had with Margaret. Instead, it enriched it, providing a fuller understanding of who he was and where he came from. On the drive back home, Ethan spoke more than he had in days. He talked about the emotions swirling inside him, about the sense of completeness he hadn't expected. Margaret smiled, grateful that he felt comfortable expressing himself, and reminded him that it was okay to take things one step at a time. The following weeks became a rhythm of gradual contact. Phone calls, texts, occasional video chats allowed Ethan to build a relationship with Claire at a pace that felt manageable. He began to see her not just as the woman who had given him life, but as a person with her own joys, struggles, and capacity for love. Margaret continued to support him, offering guidance and reassurance without interfering, helping him balance the new relationship with the bond they had always shared. One afternoon, Ethan suggested a short visit to Claire's home. Margaret accompanied him, and they were welcomed warmly. The house was cozy, filled with personal touches that reflected Claire's life and personality. Ethan met Claire's younger child, a cheerful girl named Lily, and the two quickly connected over shared interests. It was a small but meaningful moment, one that allowed Ethan to see the family environment his birth mother had created, and to understand her in a fuller context. As they spent the afternoon together, Claire pulled Ethan aside. "I know this is overwhelming," she said gently, "and I don't want you to feel any pressure. This is your choice, your journey. I'm just grateful to be part of it." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I know," he said softly, "and I want this. I want to know you, but I also want Margaret. I don't have to choose, do I?" "No," Claire replied, smiling. "You can have both. Love isn't limited." Margaret watched from the living room, her heart full. She realized that she had feared the unknown, that she worried her place in Ethan's life might be challenged. But seeing him navigate this new relationship with confidence and clarity reassured her. She understood now that love could expand, that her bond with Ethan was unshakable, and that supporting him in this journey strengthened rather than diminished their connection. In the weeks that followed, Ethan began to feel a sense of belonging he had never fully experienced before. He was learning to integrate the two families to see how they both contributed to his sense of identity. He spent time with Claire and Lily, sharing stories, laughing, and discovering the shared threads of their personalities. At the same time, he maintained his daily routines with Margaret, keeping the sense of stability and love that had always grounded him. Margaret and Claire also developed a quiet understanding. They respected each other's roles in Ethan's life, recognizing that while their connections were different, both were essential. They communicated openly, setting boundaries and offering support when needed, creating a balanced environment in which Ethan could thrive. One evening, after a particularly lively weekend visit with Claire's family, Ethan returned home with Margaret. He was quieter than usual, thoughtful, his mind processing the events of the day. Margaret asked gently, "Everything okay?" Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. I never thought I could feel so many things at once. Happy, nervous, connected. I guess it's a lot to take in." Margaret smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay. That's life, complicated, messy, and beautiful. And you're handling it really well." Over time, the initial intensity of discovery softened into a comfortable rhythm. Ethan no longer felt the raw uncertainty of the first meeting. Instead, he experienced the steady growing connection with both women who loved him. He began to see himself not as divided but as whole, enriched by understanding her origins while appreciating the life he had lived and the love that had always been around him. One evening, as the three of them sat together, sharing a quiet dinner, Ethan realized the journey had taught him something profound. Identity was not defined by a single source, nor was love limited by circumstance. It could expand, adapt, and create a sense of completeness even in the face of unexpected revelations. Margaret watched him laugh at something Claire said, feeling a deep sense of peace. She knew that the hardest moments were behind them, that the process of discovery had been emotional and intense, but that it had ultimately strengthened the bonds of love and understanding. Ethan leaned back, glancing at both women. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything. I feel, complete in a way I didn't expect." Margaret reached over, holding his hand while Claire offered a supportive smile. "That's all we ever wanted," Margaret said softly. "For you to feel loved and whole." The evening ended with quiet contentment. Ethan went to his room, feeling a sense of stability and joy he had never fully realized was possible. He understood now that the journey of discovery was not about replacing one person with another, nor about choosing between the past and present. It was about embracing the full spectrum of his life, the family that raised him, the mother he had never known, and the love that surrounded him every day. As Margaret and Claire cleaned up the kitchen, they shared a small, private moment of acknowledgement. They had both played crucial roles in Ethan's life, and their respect and understanding for each other had grown. They knew that moving forward, their focus would always be on supporting Ethan, giving him the space to navigate his identity while providing love, guidance, and stability. In the weeks and months that followed, Ethan's relationship with Claire grew steadily. He visited regularly, exchanged messages, and shared experiences with both families. Margaret remained his anchor, the constant presence that had guided him through every twist and turn of life. Together, they had created a new model of family,